Jake Callahan was the kind of man who made others forget they had a spine. Tall, imposing, with eyes as cold as a Little Rock winter. He looked like he'd been sculpted by a merciless hand. His manner was curt, his words sharper than knives, and his smile, a rare, joyless event. He had inherited his father's business at just 27, and with it, the infamous title of the Cruel Prince of Arkansas. He didn't care about anyone, not the elderly gardener who had served the family for decades, not the staff, and certainly not Kate, his fiancée of convenience, whose whims bordered on absurdity. Kate Thompson was the type of woman who seemed to live in a never-ending parade of desires. Daughter of a powerful agricultural magnate, she'd grown up believing the world was her mirror. Vain, impatient, and disarmingly arrogant, she treated everyone like pawns on the chessboard of her life. The union with Jake, aside from merging two vast fortunes, was set to be the event of the year, but 5 minutes of watching them together was enough to see. There was not a trace of love there, only a rehearsed dance between inflated egos and frosty silences. Charlotte Winslow watched it all from a distance, like someone watching a wildfire consume a forest. She was young, but her eyes told a different story. At 23, she had swallowed more tears than sweet words. Orphaned at 10, raised by a rigid aunt, she had learned early how to adapt, endure, and stay silent. The Callahan mansion had been her home for nearly 2 years. She cleaned, cooked, sewed, and endured yelling. But most of all she observed. And through the garlands of hypocrisy, she noticed things. Kate's looks of contempt, Jake's frozen boredom, and the loneliness that clung to them both, even amidst all the luxury. Charlotte was like a gentle ghost in that house. No one truly saw her, but everything in her remained firm. Her hands were skilled, her steps silent, and her heart, though bruised, still believed in beautiful things. She would pick up the shattered crystal after Kate's outbursts, and bring Jake his coffee, even knowing he'd never thank her. Deep down, something in her insisted on seeing beyond the layers of arrogance. Maybe because she knew what it was like to be invisible. Or maybe, just maybe, she sensed that something in that house was about to change. The atmosphere in the mansion was in constant turmoil. Kate yelled at the florists, fired and rehired hairdressers, and changed wedding plans weekly. Jake, on the other hand, buried himself in business and avoided unnecessary human interaction. They lived in parallel universes, forced to meet at cold dinners and uncomfortable public appearances. The only constant presence was Charlotte, always one step behind, always helpful, always invisible. But even ghosts have limits. And the girl was beginning to realize that something inside her also wanted to be seen. It was on a stifling Thursday night that everything began to change. Jake returned from the city with an expression darker than usual. He coughed quietly, refused food, something he never did, and went upstairs without a word. Kate didn't notice. She was too busy trying on dresses and complaining about a chipped nail. Charlotte, however, saw her employer's pale face. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And without knowing it, in that moment, her fate began to intertwine with his in a way neither of them could have predicted. The illness didn't announce itself. It simply settled in, like all things deep and lasting. Jake grew even more absent. The eyes once so alert to numbers and contracts now stared into the void. lost in a feverish haze. His body began to give in. His breathing, once marked by the impatience of a man used to commanding and being served, now came irregularly, often weakly. Kate, on her pedestal of ego, showed no concern. She waved off the doctor's warnings and continued planning the wedding with the coldness of someone organizing a livestock auction. "He just needs rest, that's all," she said, like one might talk about an overheated car. And so the mansion went quiet. No laughter, no shouting, no echo of expensive shoes down the hallways. Just the wind outside. And Charlotte's light footsteps, going up the stairs more often now, even knowing it could cost her the job. But it was inevitable. She didn't know how to ignore other people's pain, even if they were arrogant men who never looked her in the eyes. Charlotte never saw herself as a heroine, nor did she dream of a prince. Her ambitions were simpler. A roof, peace, and maybe, if God allowed, someone who truly saw her. The idea of caring for Jake Callahan, the man who treated staff like dust on his shoes, would have been absurd just days before. But his fevered eyes, his failing body, the complete absence of affection around him. Something pierced through her. A primitive feeling, maybe. Compassion. Instinct, or some kind of emotional stubbornness. While the rest of the house pretended the master still stood tall, she was washing his pillowcases, changing his sheets, moistening his lips with care. The doctor would come, prescribe, and leave. Jake didn't say much. When he did, it was with irritation or disdain. But she kept going. Sometimes when he slept, Charlotte would sit by the bed and just watch the storm he carried on his face, even unconscious. Perhaps that was why she didn't give up. She recognized what it was to survive while carrying too much pain in the chest. Jake, for his part, was battling a kind of weakness that wasn't just physical. He was used to being feared, obeyed, keeping every inch of himself armored against vulnerability. But now, in that bed, coughing like an old man and sweating like a sinner, he had no shield, and it drove him mad. Seeing Charlotte there, with her serene eyes and small hands, tending to him as if he mattered, made him uncomfortable. He, who used to command silence, now depended on hers. At first he refused the tease, turned his face away from the spoonful of soup, argued over having his clothes changed. But there was something in her gaze that broke him more than the fever. Charlotte didn't show pity, nor pride, only presence, and that was rare. 'Twas new, and deeply threatening for someone who always believed he needed no one. As days passed, resistance gave way to exhaustion. Jake, still bitter, began accepting small gestures. He didn't thank her, of course, his pride too loud, but he watched, and when Charlotte told him stories while he drifted between fever and clarity, something inside him stirred. She spoke with simplicity, but each sentence held a weight forged in scarcity and loss. She told of sharing bread with 3 cousins, of nights reading hidden romance novels by candlelight under the sheets. Jake, who had never had to share anything with anyone, felt small in the face of her silent strength. And for the first time in many years he listened, truly listened, and he wished, deep in his chest, that her voice wouldn't leave when the fever broke. He didn't yet know how to name what he was feeling, but he was beginning to understand. Charlotte wasn't just the maid. She was a presence, an anchor, a mirror, While Jake showed his first signs of recovery, Kate became even more absent. She showed up occasionally, only to say she couldn't stand the smell of medicine or that hospital-like energy. Her eyes, always focused on appearances, seemed to despise her now ailing fiancé even more. At social gatherings, she was already showing signs of impatience with the wedding. Whispered comments escaped her lips. "I'm not ready to become a nurse for an invalid." That reached Charlotte's ears, and she swallowed it down with a knot in her throat. But she didn't tell Jake. Not yet. He was too fragile. Still, something began to grow inside her. A quiet fury, a sense of justice. Jake might be all that he was. Cold, arrogant, spoiled. But no one deserved to be abandoned in the middle of an illness. And she, though unsure why, had decided to stay. Stay until the end, until he recovered. Or until he sent her away for good. And he hadn't sent her away. That, for Jake Callahan, was almost a cry for help. It was on an especially cold night that Jake, awakened by a chill, called out for her. He didn't say please, nor thank you, but for the first time he said her name. "Charlotte," he said, almost as if apologizing for something he never learned how to ask forgiveness for. She was in the hallway, turning off the lights, and came back immediately. Sat beside the bed, and he, still torn between pride and need, asked if she could just stay there. Say nothing. She stayed. In silence. And in that silence, something shifted. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the recognition that there was someone in the world who cared. For the first time, Jake slept without restlessness. And Charlotte, watching him, understood there was more to that man than the hardened shell he showed the world. She didn't want to change him. She just wanted to see him whole. And maybe with time he would want that too. Jake began returning to himself slowly, like someone waking from an emotional coma that had lasted longer than the fever itself. Mornings returned with a distant song of birds, and Charlotte was there, sitting, folding a shirt quietly, reading a battered old book, or just leaning against the wall, lost in thought. Jake watched more than he spoke. He started noticing the little things. The way she fluffed the pillows, how she smelled of lavender and neutral soap, how every gesture seemed to carry a care no one had ever offered him. And it unsettled him. He, who managed million-dollar contracts, couldn't manage the growing feeling that stirred whenever she gave that soft smile, even without looking at him. It was a good kind of discomfort, like the unease of something you want to deny, but have already accepted deep down. One afternoon, Jake found her sitting on the porch, her gaze lost in the fields beyond, while the setting sun painted the sky in gold. She was wrapped in an old shawl from her aunt, one she always carried with her. He, leaning on his cane, took a few shaky steps until he sat beside her. For the first time there was no tension, no walls, no commands. Just shared silence. "I never," he began, not quite knowing where he was going. Charlotte turned to him, calm, patient. "Never what?" she asked, with the voice of someone who knows how to hear what hasn't yet been said. "Never felt like this. We human," he replied. It was a small moment, but a monumental one. Jake was allowing himself to be less than perfect. And Charlotte looked at him like someone seeing, without judgment, a man trying to find himself. A man who, perhaps for the first time, missed someone not out of need, but because of presence. The following weeks brought a less hostile Jake. There were still days when pride got the better of him, when he'd scowl because he didn't want to be seen as vulnerable. But there were also moments when he asked Charlotte how her day had been. A simple thing but unheard of. She answered naturally, without forcing anything. She spoke of the garden, the chickens, the village children, the books she read when she had time. Jake laughed sometimes, especially when she teased him with some subtle joke about his fallen king demeanor. And he allowed it. He started asking her to choose the books he should read. And when the fever was finally gone, Charlotte still came to his room to adjust the cushions and bring him tea. He could have asked her to stop, but he didn't. The world was changing, and Jake slowly was changing too. One night the phone rang. It was Kate, her first call in days. Jake answered with a dry voice. She wanted to know if he'd be well enough for the charity dinner the following week, and whether his appearance would still scare the press. Jake hung up before she could finish the sentence. Charlotte said nothing. She just looked at him. And for the first time, Jake felt ashamed. Maybe it was because of how she reacted, or rather how she didn't. In that silence, he sensed the chasm between who he had been and who he was becoming. Kate stood for a world of appearances, control, and social masks. Charlotte was the opposite. The underside, the fringe, the disarming honesty of someone who doesn't play the game. And for the first time, Jake wished he were worthy of someone like her. That scared him. Because deep down, he was still the man who saw her as just a maid. And pride doesn't die easily. On a crisp October morning, Jake came down the stairs without help. The mansion seemed smaller. Or maybe he was finally seeing it with eyes that searched for something more than luxury. He found Charlotte in the kitchen baking bread. The scent of rosemary filled the air, and Jake stood still, just watching her. She turned around, surprised to see him there, and smiled, shy but honest. "Well, look who decided to walk among mortals," she teased, laughing. Jake stepped closer, tore off a piece of bread, and murmured, "This is better than any feast I've ever had." Charlotte blushed. It was their first exchange without tension, without walls, without armor. Something was shifting, and they both knew it. But neither dared to name it. Not yet. It was still too soon. But that bread, warm and simple, was more than food. It was a gesture, symbol. And Jake's heart, unknowingly, began to ask for more. That same day, something different happened. Jake asked Charlotte to walk with him to the back garden, the one where his mother used to plant roses before everything was turned to stone and concrete. It was a forgotten corner of the house, but full of memories. When they arrived, he pointed to an old bench. "This is where I decided I'd never trust anyone again," he said. She didn't ask why. She just sat beside him. They stayed there for minutes that felt like hours. The wind blew softly, filtered light touching their faces gently. Jake, not looking directly at her, whispered, "You make me question everything I believed about myself." Charlotte just squeezed his hand for a second, and then let go. It was the lightest yet most powerful touch. Jake realized he no longer wanted to be the man he had been. And deep down, he began to long for something he'd always avoided. To love. And to be loved. That foggy November morning, the gates of the Callahan estate shook under loud, impatient knocks. Charlotte, who had taken over answering the door ever since the staff had been dismissed by Kate's orders, hurried to open. Standing there was a woman in rags, eyes marked by sleepless nights, and a child in her arms. The boy had Jake's eyes. Dark, intense, with a faint scar above the left eyebrow, the same one Jake had inherited from his grandfather. The woman wasted no time. "The boy's father lives here. Jake Callahan. He's your son. And now he's your problem." Without offering further explanation, she set the child down, turned her back and vanished, leaving behind a worn backpack and a crumpled note. Charlotte stood frozen. The boy stared at her with eyes that seemed to know secrets from a life barely begun. Charlotte brought him inside with a quiet care, as if he had always been hers. She sat him at the kitchen table, offered him bread and milk, and read the note. "His name is Noah. He's 4. Jake knows who I am. But he never knew who he could be." The signature was nearly illegible. Amanda. Charlotte felt her chest tighten, not with jealousy but with compassion. She knew what it was like to be left behind. Noah was quiet, observant. He followed Charlotte with his eyes but didn't cry. Jake, hearing the soft steps down the hallway, appeared in the kitchen doorway, leaning on his cane. He stopped, looked at the boy, and froze. "What is this?" he asked, already fearing the answer. Charlotte rose slowly. "Jake. This is Noah, your son." The word son landed heavier than any pain Jake had ever known. He didn't deny it, didn't rage. He just slowly sat down. For the first time, his silence was filled with regret. In the days that followed, Noah changed the house without saying much at all. Jake didn't know how to deal with him. He watched from afar, unsure of what was expected of him. The boy's silence studied him back. Charlotte became the bridge between two worlds. She cared for Noah like someone restoring a small, fragile heart's ability to trust again. She played with him, washed his clothes, sang softly at night. Jake saw everything, silent. Inside him, a mix of shame and pride battled constantly. One rainy night, as Charlotte tucked Noah into bed, Jake stood at the door. He watched her cover the boy with the same tenderness she had once offered him. "You're being a mother to someone else's child," Jake said softly. Charlotte looked up, steady. "No. I'm being a mother to a child who needs someone." And she walked out, leaving Jake standing there, face to face with something he had never been able to name: unconditional love. Noah's presence shattered the last layers of coldness that still surrounded Jake. One day, after tripping over a toy, he let out a loud curse, and Noah, frightened, ran straight to Charlotte. Jake saw the fear in the boy's eyes, the same fear he had once instilled in countless adults. Crushed him inside. That night, he walked into Noah's room and apologized. It was a pathetic scene, almost ridiculous, but it was real. Charlotte, watching quietly from the hallway, witnessed it unseen. Jake knelt down. The man who had only ever bowed before figures and fortunes now knelt before a child. And little Noah simply placed his tiny hand on his father's head, as if to say, "It's okay," Jake cried, for the first time in years. It wasn't a noble, dignified cry. It was raw, ashamed, desperate. And Charlotte embraced him, not like a woman in love, but like someone who had finally seen in that man the seed of something good. In the days that followed, Jake began to learn things he had never imagined doing. Giving baths, making cereal, listening to bedtime stories. He made terrible mistakes, got all the schedules wrong, complained about cartoons, but he was trying. Noah, little by little, stopped being a quiet observer and started calling him Dad. Charlotte watched everything with a mix of tenderness and sadness. She knew that this love wasn't hers. It wasn't meant for her. Or at least that's what she believed. Jake, on the other hand, found himself surrounded by a new reality. He felt ridiculous wearing an apron, but he also felt a strange warmth when Noah hugged him before bed. And when Charlotte smiled at the sight of the two of them together, something inside him broke and rebuilt itself at the same time. He began to understand that love isn't earned through contracts, but through consistency, and that maybe, just maybe, there was still time to become a better man. But the past doesn't let go of its leash so easily. Kate reappeared, with flawless makeup, expensive perfume, and an open disdain for the child on the carpet. She walked in without knocking, as she always had. But what she found wasn't a palace anymore. It was a home. She found Charlotte sitting on the floor, building blocks with Noah, and Jake beside her, laughing at something silly. Kate's eyes widened. "Jake, what is this?" He stood up slowly. "This, Kate, is my life now. It's not perfect, and it's not a performance. It's real." Kate laughed loudly, but the sound found no echo. "You've become a pathetic man." Jake took a deep breath, looked at Charlotte, looked at Noah and said, "If being pathetic means learning how to love, then maybe I'm finally on the right path." Kate left, door slamming behind her. And for the first time, Jake didn't feel like he had lost something. He felt like he had finally found it. Charlotte started waking up earlier. Before the first rays of sun touched the fields of Arkansas, she was already in the kitchen making breakfast. She didn't want to be seen, didn't want to see. Slowly, her smile shortened, her laughter grew quieter, her gaze more distant. Jake noticed. Of course he noticed. The sensitivity that love was awakening in him made him more alert. But he didn't know what to do. "Are you okay?" he asked one evening, finding her alone on the porch. "Everything's great," she replied, not even looking at him. The lie in that phrase hung between them like a closed door. Charlotte wasn't pulling away because of a lack of feeling. It was precisely because she felt too much. She was afraid of being just another passing story in the life of a man who now wanted to love, but maybe only knew how to repay loyalty, not true love. As Jake rebuilt himself emotionally beside Noah, Charlotte buried herself in doubts. What if I'm just a beautiful chapter in a book he's still learning how to write? She wondered while washing the dinner dishes. She didn't want to be loved out of gratitude. She didn't want to be remembered as the woman who cared for him during his sickness, raised his son, kept his house in order. She wanted to be loved for who she was. With her unpretentious sweetness, her quiet courage, her unseen sensitivity. Jake meanwhile misread the signs. He thought everything was fine. After all, they were there together, raising Noah, living peaceful days. But there was an absence in her eyes. A silence between each touch. An invisible wall that his love still didn't know how to break. Charlotte needed to know if she was chosen or just convenient, and that Jake hadn't yet learned how to show. One day, Charlotte didn't return from the market. Jake waited. First minutes, then hours. Noah fell asleep on the couch, and Jake's heart began to beat faster, not from worry for her safety, but from fear of abandonment. When she finally came back, arms full of groceries and eyes red, he tried to act normal. "Everything okay?" She smiled, set the bread on the table and said, "Yes." But that yes tasted like goodbye. That night, Jake didn't sleep. He stood in the hallway, staring at Charlotte's bedroom door. He thought about knocking, about telling her he was scared, but he didn't know how. He had never learned. The next morning, she left early again, and left an envelope in the kitchen, handwritten. To Jake. Inside, a letter. Short, clear, painful. "I need to know who you are when you're not depending on me, and who I am when I'm not by your side. If this is love, it will know how to wait. Charlotte." Jake stood frozen in front of those words, as if he'd taken a punch to the chest. He didn't scream. He didn't chase after her. He didn't curse. For the first time, he understood. Understood that Charlotte wanted a love that didn't come from chaos or necessity. She wanted to be loved by choice, not by circumstance. He spent the days that followed in silence. Noah felt her absence more than anyone. He cried at night, asked for her. Jake tried to comfort him with stories he made up, with disastrous pancake attempts, with off-key lullabies. But everything felt incomplete. He missed her even in the corners of the house she never walked through. He began to understand that loving someone was more than needing them. It was desiring their presence even when everything was fine. It was wanting to build, not just survive together. Charlotte, on the other hand, had taken refuge at her aunt's house in another town. She didn't share details, just said she needed time. She wanted to see herself outside the universe that kept pulling her into a role that might not be hers. Every morning, she woke up feeling the ache of absence, the smell of coffee brewing, the sound of Noah running through the house, Jake's voice reading aloud whatever nonsense he found, just to fill the silence. But she also felt peace. The kind of peace that comes only when you're truly alone with yourself. She read books she had abandoned, wrote letters she'd never send, and surprisingly, she began to like herself again. She didn't want Jake to chase after her. She wanted him to grow, to discover on his own the worth of a woman who chose to love, not out of need, but because she saw in him a soul under construction. Charlotte knew. She would only return if her heart was called, not coerced. When Charlotte finally received a letter from Jake, it wasn't written in fancy words or desperate promises. It was simple, honest. Folded inside was a drawing by Noah. 3 stick figures holding hands. The letter read, "I think I understand now. You taught me what love is. And now I can only ask one thing. Teach me how to do this on my own. Come back whenever you want. But know that here, there's a home waiting. No obligations. Just love." Charlotte cried. For the first time in days, she truly cried. And she smiled. She didn't know if she'd return tomorrow or next week. But one thing she was sure of, that man was finally ready. Maybe for the first time in his life. What would you do if you had to walk away from someone? Just to find out if what you feel is real love. Comment below, subscribe, and leave a like. There's more emotion coming your way. It was morning when Charlotte returned. No announcement, no grand entrance. Just the sound of her steady footsteps on the wooden porch. Jake was in the kitchen distracted when he heard Noah scream, "Mommy!" and run like time had turned back. She knelt to embrace him and felt his little hands press against her face as if making sure she was real. Jake appeared, wide-eyed, soul disarmed. They stood there, between the birdsong and a silence louder than any speech. She didn't say, "I'm back." He didn't say, "I missed you." But his eyes carried the question, and hers, the answer. Charlotte walked inside and saw everything the same, and everything different. It was as if absence had cleaned the house and rearranged their feelings. The following days were quiet and tender. Jake now knew how to wait, to listen, to breathe before reacting. He made coffee for her, sometimes wrong, sometimes without sugar, but he made it. Charlotte laughed, more with her eyes than her lips. Noah, sensing the adults' emotional dance, insisted on bringing them together, sitting between them on the couch, calling them both to watch cartoons, asking for bedtime stories told by both. But Charlotte noticed something else. Jake had grown quieter, too thoughtful. Sometimes he disappeared for hours into the library or the office. She respected the silence, but her heart knew. He was hiding something. And it wasn't pride anymore. It was fear. The fear of losing again. And this time to something even he couldn't name. One autumn afternoon, while Charlotte dusted the old office bookshelf, she found a cardboard box hidden behind accounting books. Curious, she opened it. Inside, an old teddy bear, a baby onesie, and a yellowed photo. A young woman holding a newborn with Jake's eyes. Her heart raced. When Jake walked in and saw her with the box, he froze. For a moment, it was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. "She left me the baby and disappeared. Noah. He's my son. But I only found out when he was almost 2. She never wanted to raise him. Said I was the father. And now it was my turn to deal with it." Charlotte listened in silence. Not for lack of reaction, but because deep down, she had always known. Felt it. There was always a story there. She just hadn't known it ran so deep. So tangled in abandonment and pain. Jake sat beside her, weighed down by the world. "I was never really a father. I cared for him because it was the right thing to do. But Charlotte, I only became a father when you came into our lives. When you taught him to laugh, to eat right, to sleep without fear. No, I finally understand what family is." She gently touched his hand, free of judgment. "It doesn't matter where he came from. What matters is where he's going. And if he's going with love, he'll go far." Jake looked at her with tearful eyes. For the first time there was no ego. No walls. Just the man. Just the father. Just the love he was learning to carry. With all the imperfection of someone who always had everything. Except a heart. And there, on that wooden floor, Charlotte felt it. They were finally standing on the same page of the map. Life together began to bloom again, like spring after a harsh winter. Jake, more present than ever, told bedtime stories to Noah, always inventing happy endings. Charlotte listened from the doorway, sitting on the hallway floor, arms wrapped around her knees, wearing a smile that blended relief and tenderness. She began redecorating the house, changing the curtains, planting flowers in the garden, as if trying to root their new season of life into the soil. One day, while washing her hands at the sink, she felt a strange dizziness. Then again, then nausea. As a precaution, she visited the town doctor. She came back with a folded paper in her pocket and a secret in her heart. Jake was in the barn when she approached. He smiled. She handed him the paper without saying a word. He read it and froze. You're pregnant." She nodded with a small smile. He held her as if embracing a whole new life. And that's exactly what he was doing. Time passed quickly after that. The seasons changed like scenes in a new screenplay. Jake, more of a man than ever before, began preparing everything for the baby's arrival. And Charlotte, amidst tiny clothes and sudden cravings for peach pie, felt love solidify into something that could no longer be undone. Noah called her belly "my magic little brother," and gently touched it every day, as if protecting the future itself. Jake began writing letters to the baby that hadn't yet arrived, maybe as a way to make sure this child would always know what he took so long to learn. Love is not a debt, it's a decision, and when you choose it, everything else becomes a consequence. The morning of the wedding arrived with a soft drizzle, the kind that washes roads, rooftops, and old memories. Jake stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. Not out of fear but reverence. "I think I've never done anything so right in my life," he said as Noah walked into the room, dressed in a small beige suit and flashing a toothless smile. The boy held a little box with the rings and asked, with the most serious tone he could muster, "Is today the day you become my real dad?" Jake knelt, held the boy's face in both hands and replied, "No, my son. That happened the day you fell asleep on my chest and taught me what it means to love someone more than yourself." Noah smiled and hugged him tightly. That morning, Jake was no longer the arrogant millionaire from before. He was just a man who understood what he had to lose, and who, because of that, had learned to treasure everything he had gained. Charlotte wore a simple white linen dress, handmade by her aunt. Her hair was loose, with small lavender sprigs tucked between soft waves. No heavy makeup, no veil. Just the serenity of someone who had arrived at the altar without rush, without pressure. She walked through the garden, beneath an improvised arch of wildflowers, and when her eyes met Jake's, everything stopped. The guests disappeared. Time vanished. It was as if, in silence, they were telling each other, "It took a while, but we made it." The ceremony was brief. The rain ceased like magic. Their hands clasped not out of nerves but certainty. And when the word yes left their lips, it wasn't shouted, it was whispered. But no one doubted the strength with which it echoed inside their chests. After the wedding, the Callahan house, once cold, full of marble and silence, became a real home. Charlotte transformed every room with her warmth, her sticky notes on the fridge, her recipes that often burned in the oven but always warmed the soul. Jake worked less, looked people in the eye more, and learned to listen without interrupting. On Friday nights, he told made-up stories to Noah and the baby growing in Charlotte's belly, with funny voices and hearty laughter. And on many Sundays, Jake would look up at the sky and marvel at how falling from pride had been the very thing that allowed him to be lifted by the hands of someone who had loved him before he even knew how to love. He no longer saw Charlotte as the former maid. He saw her as the woman who rebuilt the man from the wreckage of the Millionaire. When the baby was born, on a warm summer night, Jake held the little girl in his arms as if carrying the whole world and said, "Welcome, Ivy. Everything's going to be different for you." Charlotte, sweaty and exhausted, smiled. Noah came in with a flower in his hand and placed it gently in the makeshift crib, saying, "So she'll always know there's love here." Jake cried. For the third time in his life, he cried without shame. Because now his strength came from tenderness. Because now his tears weren't from failure, but from gratitude. He was no longer that man from the beginning, unbearable, controlling, blinded by vanity. He was a father, a husband, a man who had faced the one thing most never dare to. The truth that love changes everything, but only after it breaks your pride. In the birthdays that followed, Charlotte always hung a new family photo in the hallway. In one of them, Ivy was biting into a strawberry cake with both hands, while Noah strummed a guitar and Jake pulled a silly face. That was it. Simple, authentic, perfect in its imperfection. The old Callahan mansion, once a monument to wealthy loneliness, was now filled with noise, scattered toys, and the smell of fresh bread. And when neighbors passed by and asked if Jake had really changed, Charlotte would reply with a shy smile, "No. He just discovered that loving is more powerful than commanding." And she was right. That love wasn't easy. It wasn't instant. But it was whole. It rose from the ashes, grew with patience, and became home. The kind of home where even the wind feels lighter. In the end, it wasn't money or blood or fate that brought Jake and Charlotte together. It was the courage to keep going, even when everything screamed to give up. It was the kind of love that was born in scarcity, bloomed through pain, and overcame the past. Because loving someone who's already good, that's easy. But loving someone when they don't yet know how to be, that's rare. And Charlotte had that courage. Jake had that luck. And we had this story. May it live on as memory. May it touch hearts as truth. And may it remind each of us that sometimes love doesn't come in the beginning, but it always comes, right on time.